When I was in the theological college studying to become a minister, my favorite class was learning the Greek language of the New Testament. In case you're interested, the New Testament was written originally in a dialect of ancient Greek known as Koine, or Common Greek, which was the everyday language of the day of Jesus, the international language of business, if you will. And one of the exercises I will never forget having to do in the Greek class was take my turn and stand in front of the entire class and recite aloud two verses of the New Testament in Greek, so well as we would be able to try and pronounce it. And we were able to pick any two verses out of the New Testament we wanted, except for one, which was disqualified. The Gospel of John, chapter 11, verse 35, Jesus wept. Now, you can well imagine why this would not count. It was not very long, and so not enough of a challenge to memorize. Now, while that is a verse which doesn't get us a lot of credit for our memory work, it is a very profound one spiritually. Jesus wept. When those of us who have been part of church for some or much of our lives reflect upon all that the New Testament tells us about Jesus and what the tradition of the Christian church tells us about Jesus, that he is Emmanuel, God with us, that he is a God taken on human flesh, that we learn about God as fully as we possibly can in the person of Jesus, to reflect on the fact that Jesus could and did cry. Jesus grieved. In the Gospel of John, chapter 11, his dear friend Lazarus had died, and he was moved to tears. And of course, all of us know that at various points in our lives, we grieve. We are sad at a loss. In fact, grief is defined as our reaction to the loss of someone or something. And the more important that thing or person or relationship was to us, the greater our sense of loss and the greater our feelings of grief. As perhaps many of you know, we are in this season working our way through a congregational curriculum known as The Story, and we are just over partway through that. And for this week, our portion of the biblical narrative is the Old Testament book of the prophet Jeremiah. And the book of the prophet Jeremiah is in many ways a story of grief. The prophet Jeremiah lived in the latter part of the 7th century and the beginning part of the 6th century BC. And Jeremiah lived in and witnessed a period of great national crisis for ancient Israel, a period which came to a climax in the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 587 BC at the hands of the Babylonian Empire. And this national crisis, this eventual destruction of the national capital, was portrayed as the judgment of God on the unfaithfulness of God's people. And so Jeremiah gave great voice to the grief of this time. And yet, surprisingly, like the other prophets of the day, was also able to inject a word of hope from God, a word of promise in the future that God planned to offer to the people of God. The prophet Jeremiah described various kinds of grief. One kind of grief was a national or collective grief. It was the grief of all of God's people together. It was the grief of ancient Israel. During the decades of Jeremiah's prophetic ministry, the people of ancient Israel experienced political instability, economic turmoil, and severe military defeats. In the year 587, as I mentioned, the Babylonian Empire essentially overran and conquered what was left of free territory. They burned the city of Jerusalem to the ground, and the leaders of the nation were taken off into exile to live in other parts of the Babylonian Empire. This was a common military tactic in the ancient world. A conquering army would deport the leaders of a conquered nation so that they could not plot a revolution. And so the nation would be permanently weakened. This defeat saw the destruction of Solomon's temple, and it brought an end to the Davidic dynasty. That is, after that day, no longer would there be a descendant of King David on the throne. And so it was the utter destruction of the nation of God's people. And they grieved this loss. They grieved all of the different kinds of loss, and perhaps most of all, their sense of national unity and identity. This is a kind of collective grief that is not totally unfamiliar in our day. Some of us came to Canada from countries which had been overrun in war and know what it is to grieve collectively. Christians in our day and age often grieve collectively. Some of us remember a time in the not-so-distant memory when, much like the people of God in ancient Israel, we represented the norm, the mainstream of society. Churches were filled and overflowing. The media and politicians and national figures of prominence shared a common worldview, common set of ethics. And that's not the way it is anymore. We are now a minority spiritually. In the 1960s, the United Church of Canada built a new church once a week somewhere in Canada. In the 21st century, we're probably closing them at much the same rate. Many of us grieve that our friends and family do not share our beliefs. We have to adjust to a whole new form of spiritual life as a minority. And that is a kind of grief that we share. But as the prophet Jeremiah offered a word of hope to the people of Israel in the midst of their devastation, so there is a word of hope for us. And that word of hope is the story of the person of Jesus. In particular, his incarnation, that theological word for his taking on flesh, for God's becoming human in Jesus. For you see, in Jesus, God saw things as we see them. God experienced life just as we experience it. God felt as we feel. God suffered as we suffer. In Jesus, God is standing in solidarity with us. And our grief does not imply isolation or loneliness, for we know that God stands with us, even in our grief. There's another kind of grief spoken of by the prophet Jeremiah, and that is the grief of God. Probably the largest section of the book of the prophet Jeremiah, if we were to count the words, is taken up with expressions of God's grief over a severed relationship with God's people. In chapter 2, which Larry read for us a few minutes ago, God says through the prophet, I led you through the wilderness, and you followed me through that barren land. And yet now, in the midst of your suffering, you do not even seem to ask where I am. You've chased after other gods, the so-called gods of the nations. And there's a beautiful poetic imagery. God says through the prophet, you have left behind a fountain of living water, and instead dug cisterns in the ground. Cisterns that do not even hold water. God grieves at the broken relationship with God's people. And this grief is like that of a parent who grieves over a wayward child. I know someone who is probably about my parents' age, I suppose. And her son, when he was a youngster, was a star. He did well in school. He was polite. He was cheerful. He got along with his friends. Kind of son that everyone would like to have. The summer after grade 8 and before grade 9, he got a job working on a farm as a laborer. And over the course of that summer, he was influenced in a very negative way by some of the older boys who were also working at the farm for the summer. And they got him into drugs, started using drugs. And very quickly, he became addicted. And ever since that time, his life has been in a downward spiral. He's been to jail many times. And he gets out of jail and things go okay for a little while, and then the break and enters start. He's got to pay for the drugs that he's addicted to. And try to imagine for a moment the grief of those parents who did everything they could for their son. Loved him, paid attention to him. Through no fault of their own, their son's life has gone badly off the rails. And as I stand here today, there is no resolution to their grief. The book of Jeremiah gives voice to God's grief over a severed relationship caused by the unfaithfulness of God's people. And yet, as the prophet Jeremiah offered a word of hope, so there is a word of hope for us. And it is the story of the person of Jesus. In particular, his death on the cross. Just the other day, Lisa and I were having a conversation about Jesus' death on the cross, and reflecting on what exactly does that mean? Why did it happen? What are the implications for us as human beings? And I express that it is my view that the cross is the inevitable collision between the sin of humankind and the great, loving faithfulness of God. The cross is the story of God being willing to do absolutely whatever it takes to restore relationship with us. Another kind of grief spoken of by the prophet Jeremiah is individual grief. The prophet Jeremiah, as a faithful person of God, grieved mightily over the situation of his compatriots. He grieved over their personal suffering and misery, and he grieved over their spiritual impoverishment. And we know by simple process of deduction that there was an immense amount of grief among Jeremiah's contemporaries. We know of the economic turmoil and what kind of poverty must have existed and what kind of suffering must have come out of that. We know of their terrible military defeats. And we know in those defeats how many of Israel's soldiers must have fallen on the battlefield. And therefore, we know how many people of the day lost sons and brothers and friends and fathers and so on and so forth. Tremendous grief on a personal level. We all know what it is to grieve. We have experienced loss, every single one of us. If there is somebody sitting here today who has yet to lose and yet to grieve, we know that day is coming. We grieve loss of relationships. Loved ones pass on. Marriages break down. Children go astray. Friends betray us. Jobs and careers are lost. Hopefulness for the future seems at times to fade away. Sometimes there seems no possibility of resolution to the problems we face. And yet, as the prophet Jeremiah spoke a word of hope to his contemporaries in a situation of great misery, so there is a word of hope for us. And it is the story of the person of Jesus. in particular, his resurrection from the dead. If the story of Jesus' death on the cross is the inevitable collision between the goodness of God and the sin of humankind, the resurrection is the promise that God overcomes everything. There is no sin, there is no evil, there is nothing which God has not already overcome and promises to overcome in our human experience. The resurrection is the story of the promise of God's ultimate victory. It is the assurance that God solves problems which are beyond our ability even to imagine. And because of this great hope and our faith therein, God gives us a mission in the world. A good news to proclaim. And a reason for being, despite whatever grief we may be feeling in the moment. There's a therapist and a writer named Susan Berger, and she has written a recent book about grief. And she has, I think, provided an interesting breakdown of the way that different folks respond to grief, which in many ways comes out of the different kinds of personalities that we have. She said, some folks are what she calls memorialists. That is, they cling with fondness and thanksgiving to the memory of what has been. It is no more, but there is still the memory. And much to celebrate in that. There are those she calls normalizers, those who, in the midst of grief, seek as quickly as possible to find a new normal. Those who find comfort in the establishment of a new kind of routine and a new way of life. There are those she calls activists. Those are folks who seek to ensure that their grief will have some meaning beyond the grief. Say in helping and supporting others who are going through grief. There are those she calls seekers. Those who seek in religion or philosophy or some other kind of system of thought to look at the world in a different way and to reframe things spiritually. I think all of us probably would tend towards one of those more than the others, but perhaps the lines would bleed and we would draw something from each. Wherever you would fall in that spectrum, let me leave you with words of hope. I think the prophet Jeremiah would agree with if he were here today, that in Jesus, God has come to us. God knows our grief. God shares our grief. And God promises to overcome it. In the near future and for all eternity. Thanks be to God. Amen.